Becoming a Navy pilot has been a dream of many. Few are able to actually make the cut. Even after becoming a naval officer, they still have years of training ahead of them. Advanced Strike Pipeline and SEER School are just a few of the many great grueling obstacles set in front of their ultimate goal of owning a set of Navy flight rigs. Today we are able to talk with a man who spent 12 years in the cockpits of some of the most spectacular fighting machines ever created.
Thank you for joining us for today's edition of Person to Person. Today we're speaking to Captain Gunnar Edelstein. Captain Edelstein spent over 12 years as a military aviator and is today to talk about the experience. So, there's obviously a really rigorous selection process involved in recruiting Navy pilots. Could you explain to us what really happens during that process?
Well, there are really three phases. They're looking for, obviously, academic achievement, physical fitness, and then the ability to think under pressure and operate under pressure. You have to be very attention to detail oriented, and you have to be able to handle a very dynamic situation at any time, because that's what you're going to be faced with.
So what planes have you flown during your period as a Navy aviator, and what plane was your favorite? Was there one that you always sought to fly during the day?
Well, I flew many different types of airplanes, but my absolute favorite was the McDonnell Douglas A4 Skyhawk. It was a single seat, single engine fighter jet. This airplane was very high performance, very highly maneuverable, incredibly rugged airplane, and it was just a dream to fly. That was probably my all-time favorite. I also flew the A-10 Thunderbolt, which was another airplane, fighter type jet, and different type, much more modern airplane, but not quite as high performance, but very fantastic airplane to fly.
So what was the typical gear involved when you would be in the aircraft? But was there a lot of it, or was there not very much at all?
No, we actually carried a lot of gear. We started out with a torso harness, then you had your parachute harness, your G suit, we had a flight helmet, you had an oxygen mask, you had all your survival gear. You had a survival radio, you had a weapon, you might carry a little bit of water, and charts. We had navigation gear, and that was pretty much the stuff that you took into the cockpit with you. So you had quite a bit of stuff, and the trick was to get it all positioned in the right place, because once you got going, it was really hard you didn't have room to maneuver in the cockpit to get at this stuff, but that's typically what we had.
So after this selection process, you're in the air, you're flying your aircraft. What's the most challenging part of being a fighter pilot? What are you paying attention to the most, and what really is not in the front of your mind when you're flying?
Okay, Harrison, the thing when you're flying in a fighter aircraft and you're doing what we call air combat maneuvering or dogfighting, you have to be able to think and operate in a three-dimensional mode. We here on ground are operating in 2 dimensions. When you're in the air, you're operating in 3 dimensions all the time. And the thing about flying, if you're doing dogfighting, you have to think where that airplane is going to be, not where it is right now. If you're focusing on where it is now, you're way behind the power curve. You got to figure out, where is this guy or lady, because there are women fighter pilots nowadays. You have to figure out where that airplane is going to be, not where it is right now. So that's kind of the trick to fight, air combat maneuvering. So you have to be, we always used to say, you got to be 100 miles ahead of the airplane at all times. Well, nowadays it's probably more like 300 or 400 miles ahead, because the airplanes are faster and more capable and more maneuverable. So I think you have to be able to really focus. focus is just incredible. Attention to detail and focus are really very, very important when you're flying an airplane.
Was there any way that you used, like any kind of trick that you used to predict where airplanes were going? Or just kind of like as you saw them go, and you kind of used that to figure out where they're headed next?
Well, it's kind of you have to, a lot of practice. You see what you're in a practice environment with another airplane, and you know kind of what maneuver he's going to do, so you know where he's going. So you get in the real thing, you see that airplane, that Russian MiG or whoever it is, doing a maneuver, you know where he's going. And you have to position yourself accordingly to be in the right position to take advantage. So it's like seeing it over and over and over again, and a lot of, many hours of practice.
So can you walk us through what goes into a night landing on a moving aircraft carrier?
Okay, that's very good question. Doing a night carrier landing is probably the most difficult aviation maneuver that I can think of. I can't think of anything that's more difficult. Maybe doing a lunar landing on the moon, but doing a night carrier landing on a moving aircraft carrier, which is doing about 20 miles an hour over the water. So you're coming in, you're at about 500 feet, you're doing about 180 knots, and you're totally on instruments. You're coming in, you fly that all the way into about 3/4 of a mile, and then you transition to the glide path, and now you go totally visual, where you're looking at your lineup on the center line of the flight deck, your glide path, which we call the meatball, and then you're flying angle of attack, which is basically airspeed. So you're looking at meatball, lineup, angle of attack, meatball, lineup, angle of attack. And so it's lineup, glide slope, airspeed, and you're constantly processing that information. You have very little visual cues out in your peripheral vision, and if there's no moon or you're below a cloud layer, there's absolutely no other visual references. You're just looking at a set of lights, trying to line all this stuff up. You're going about 150 miles an hour. The ship's moving away from you at an angle, so it's really, really challenging. I mean, you have to focus 100%, 150% of the time, and there was never an easy night carrier landing. They were all difficult.
Sounds very strenuous. So, walk us through a normal day of taking off, landing, flight process on an aircraft carrier.
Okay, good question. We operate on a very, very strict schedule, as you can imagine. So let's just say we had, say, a 10 o'clock launch. Have breakfast about 7 o'clock. You'd show up in the ready room at about 8 o'clock. We would have a briefing from 8 to 9. We would go over what the target is, where we're going, who's going, what are the call signs, what are our radio procedures, what's the weapons plan. We'd get a meteorology, a weather briefing. We'd get an intelligence briefing by the ship's intelligence officer. And then anything else that we'd need to talk about. And we'd suit up, head up to the flight deck at about 9 o'clock, do a pre-flight, external pre-flight of the airplane, check all the flight surfaces, check all the weapons, make sure they're in place properly. Get in the airplane about 9:15, and we would start engines at about 9:30, and we'd be taxiing up to the catapults probably about 10 minutes to 10. And at 10 o'clock, this whole thing, once the air wing was really had a lot of practice and was in really tip-top shape. 10 o'clock, it was like boom, 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 boom. We would start the launch sequence. And we had 4 catapults, 2 on the bow, 2 on the mid cats. They'd have 4 airplanes situated, so they'd launch one from the bow, one from the mid, one from the bow, one from the mid, and just keep that cycle going until all 25 or 30 airplanes were launched. And we could get that done very quickly. And it was, so you go out, you fly your mission, come back and land, and now you have we would have a debrief back in the ready room. What happened? Did we hit the target? What went on? What went right? Anything go wrong? And debrief the whole flight. And then the air wing landing signal officer would come and debrief you on your landing. You were graded on every landing you made. It was a 4-point system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 being the best. It better be either a 3 or a 4, or you probably are going to get tossed off the ship for lack of performance. So everything was graded, everything was monitored. It was, you had to perform all the time. That was that would be a kind of a typical mission sequence.
So a lot of viewers might not know what a catapult is. What exactly does that do, and what exactly is it?
Okay. A catapult, basically, in simplest terms, is like a giant slingshot which fires or launches the airplane off the ship. Because we only had maybe 150 feet of runway for takeoff, as opposed to, say, 8,000 or 10,000 feet, say, at JFK. So you're sitting there at 0 airspeed. This thing launches you from 0 to about 150 in about a second and a half. It'll get you enough flying speed to get the airplane flying, and it's a pretty incredible experience. You're sitting there, and you go through the whole preparation, and when everything is all set, the launch officer gives the signal, and boom, you are gone. You are gone very fast.
So how would you describe the change from fighting fighter jets to commercial aircraft carriers?
Okay, good question, Harrison. Flying in the military is all about putting either weapons on the target or shooting down your enemy, or you're kind of an instrument of foreign policy, you're fighting a war. Commercial aviation, you're transporting passengers from point A to point B as safely and as comfortably as possible, and it's all about you're making a profit in commercial aviation. We weren't trying to make a profit in the Navy. It's a whole different ball game. The principles of aviation are exactly the same. The preparation is, the attention to detail is pretty much the same. We don't do the same thing with a commercial airliner that you did with a military jet, but the principles of flying and aviation and airmanship pretty much all the same. So if you're a good military or Navy fighter pilot, you're probably going to be an excellent airline pilot, commercial pilot.
Okay. So you know that many people grow up wanting to be a Navy aircraft fighter. What would you say to this, and would you go back yourself 25 years ago and redo all of this?
Harrison, it would take me less than a nanosecond to turn the clock back and do it all over again. I would do it again in a heartbeat. I'd love to go back and do it all over again. So yes, absolutely, I would definitely do that.
And so to the people that were thinking of becoming a Navy fighter pilot, what would you tell them to make sure that they focus on?
Well, academic preparation, physical fitness, and get aviation experience. Start reading about aviation, start learning about airplanes, study some basic aerodynamics, physics, chemistry, math, basic algebra and math. You're going to use that all the time. So the better you are academically, the more physically fit you are, and the more prepared you are in terms of your aviation knowledge. That's really the foundation of how to get started.
So if you get the chance to fly any plane for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Another great question. There's a brand new airplane that's out there called the F-22 Raptor. It can do things that wasn't even in existence when I was flying, and it is by far the highest performance fighter jet in the world right now. I don't think there's anything out there that's even remotely close. So yes, I'd love to fly the F-22 Raptor.
Well, that sounds like a very powerful aircraft. I would like to say thanks to my guest, Captain Edelstein, for joining us today and showing us a brief glimpse into what it's like to be a Navy fighter pilot. So let's say thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Harrison. My pleasure. I hope it's been informative. Answer a few questions, give a little bit of a glimpse into what it's like to be an aviator, and thanks to Norwalk Community College.
Well, I hope everyone will join us next time for Person to Person, where we'll meet more interesting people. Have a great night.